I've been doing, like, for the past 4 hours, just been sitting and doing research for this. It's a complicated topic. There's a lot to it, a lot of information. I think I'm going to do this segment pretty differently than what I do a lot of other ones. Why does it sound like this is like a group project thing? I just like start my stream and I talk to you guys as if this was a group project. As many of you may know, there's a little bit of a little something going on in Canada right now. Just a few people, they took their trucks and they're kind of parked in weird places or whatever. I mean, they should just park a ticket really and be on their way, but apparently it's like a really big deal, so I need to talk about it here. No, but seriously, there's been a lot of discussions recently about the Canada Convoy protest, otherwise called the Freedom Convoy by certain people, and most recently, it's been brought up to attention because there's been discussions and there has been a declaration of a state of emergencies by the Canadian government, and there have been a wide range of different means put in place in order to end the blockades that these convoys are having in the Canadian state and on certain bridges and stuff like that. And because of that, there's a lot of discussions right now about government overreach and handling of protests and stuff like that. And that's why there's a lot of discussions on it. Many people have commented on it, and it's a pretty complex situation. So I will actually have a rather different approach to this than a lot of people do. I spent quite a bit of time researching this, and I have come to see that it's a pretty complicated situation. There's a lot to look out for. There's a lot to know. There's a lot of different possibilities, and there's a lot of intricate legal details and, you know, details about how everything unfolded that you really need to have 100% in place in order to be able to make strong, concrete opinions on these things. I don't personally feel like I haven't seen sufficient information for me to stake out a strong position. So what my purpose is going to be in this segment is I'm going to try to give a fairly nonpartisan rundown of everything that is going on and just focus on, hey, this is what's happening, these are the facts, this is public opinion, this is what a state of emergency is, this is the history of this are the damages that have been done, and stuff like that. And then I'm going to give my thoughts on a set of arguments or some general thoughts that I have flowing around, and give my kind of cursory opinion on what's going on right now based on the information that I have. So with that out of the way, let's begin. So the Canada Convoy protest started on January the 22nd and then later converged on Ottawa on the 29th. The main reason behind this is it started as an anti-vaccine mandate protest. There had been a temporary waiver of the need for truckers going across Canada and the US to be vaccinated, and that waiver was coming to a close, so the truckers had to get vaccinated, and that was kind of the starting event that brought a lot of people out to protest against the vaccine mandates and anti-vaccine mandate protests. But later, as this continued, it evolved into just general anti-COVID restriction protests. As for the protests themselves, there has been quite a bit of, you know, like far-right presence and stuff going on there. You have, I mean, fairly cursory things like, for instance, stuff like this flowing around, just like, you know, pictures of people marching around with, you know, Nazi flag. There's a libertarian flag here, which, I mean, interesting combinations of flags there, fuck Trudeau flags and the Canadian flag and stuff like that. So you have stuff like that going on. So beyond there being more like further right-wing iconography, you know, waved around, some infamous clips circling around of, you know, racist things being done, racist things being said, and, you know, connections to QAnon. There's also a bit more substantive things we can talk about here. So I'm going to actually just read out word for word the Wikipedia page on the extremist group links to the convoy protests. So here we go. Extremist group links. In the lead up to the planned arrival in Ottawa, it was reported on January 25th that far-right and white supremacist groups were hoping for violence on Parliament Hill akin to the 2021 United States Capitol attack. This has caused organizer Tamara Lich to address convoy members and denounce political violence, saying that protesters should hold a peaceful protest instead. Organizers and leaders of the convoy condemned extremist groups and asked that participants report lawbreakers to the police. They also stated that any extremists found would be removed from the convoy. Despite this, some protesters were photographed waving Confederate, Gadsden, or Nazi flags at the rally. On January 28th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau expressed concern that a small amount of protesters were going to be posing a threat during the weekend. One of the lead organizers of the convoy, James Botter, had previously stated support for QAnon, endorsed conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2020 US presidential election, and called for the arrest of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for alleged treason. On February 3rd, 2022, Romana Didulo arrived in Ottawa with supporters. Didulo calls herself the Queen of Canada and is a conspiracy theorist linked to QAnon. In November 2021, she called on her 73,000 Telegram followers to shoot healthcare workers. An episode of the Faulkner Focus, hosted by Harris Faulkner, was criticized by the Daily Beast in February 2022 for trying to normalize these protests and anti-vaccine sentiments. The episode said that protesters were not a fringe minority, but represented the mainstream of society and had international support. The montage of protests as she showed prominently displayed imagery relating to QAnon. The Facebook page for the convoy has shared content from and listed as an organizer the Wexit co-founder and Yellow Vest Canada organizer Patrick Pat King, who has previously hosted counter-protests to anti-racism rallies, spread COVID-19 misinformation, and spread the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. In December 2021, while talking about COVID-19 public health measures, King said, "The only way this is going to be solved is with bullets." On February 8th, King falsely claimed that 50% of the Ottawa police force have turned in their resignations today. Tamara Lich, the protest fundraiser, is secretary for Mavericks Party, a Western Canadian separatist group formerly known as Wexit Canada. Lich was previously the regional coordinator for Wexit in the southeast Alberta and a board member for Wexit Alberta. The Maverick Party denied involvement with the convoy on January 24th. Action for Canada, which is associated with the Canada Unity Group inside the Freedom Convoy, has been called an Islamophobic and anti-LGBT hate and conspiracy group. It holds web pages for the dangers of political Islam, health consequences of 5G technology, and the alleged underreporting by the mainstream media of adverse reactions to the vaccine. Action for Canada appears to have been founded by Tanya Gaw, who actively supported the Yellow Vest protests of 2019. Jason Lafosse, pardon me for mispronouncing, Canada's Unity Ontario organizer and official representative to the Freedom Convoy, is also a main organizer for No More Lockdowns Canada, an anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine mandate organization primarily associated with expelled Ontario MPP Randy Hillier. No More Lockdowns Canada holds anti-lockdown rallies across Ontario. Benjamin Ditcher, who was listed as an organizer on the Freedom Convoy's GoFundMe page, was a speaker at the inaugural 2019 People's Party of Canada National Convention, and he claimed political Islam has infiltrated the Conservative Party of Canada and is rotting away at our society like syphilis. Convoy leader Dave Steenberg has posted material by Soldiers of Odin, a neo-Nazi vigilante group, on his Facebook page. Jason Lafosse, the administrator of the Convoy Facebook page, has done the same thing. Lafosse has also posted a photo of himself wearing a Soldiers of Odin jacket. Following the seizure of weapons, ammunition, and body armor at the blockade in Coutts, one piece of body armor was identified to have patches signifying relation to accelerist right-wing militia Diagolon. So, you know, plenty of evidence that there is a lot of far-right presence. There's a lot of extremist presence among these protesters. This is not just a group of, you know, concerned citizens voicing their concerns. There's a lot more nefarious and a lot more radical forces and participants at play at these protests. Furthermore, there is general unruliness and disrespect. So, for instance, one of the more notable ones was the, you know, defacing and the dancing on top of the grave of an unnamed soldier, which is a, you know, like it's a national war memorial. So you have that going on as well, among other things. Furthermore, there's also been a concerning use of children when it comes to the protests. So, for instance, roughly 100 kids living in trucks involved in Ottawa convoy protests, says police. This was as of February 8th. There's a lot of kids being taken to these protests and remaining at these protests, you know, kind of like living there, living in the convoys and sleeping there, which obviously makes police action in dispelling the protests a lot more complicated since there are now kids involved. Furthermore, there's also been discussions about people using kids as human shields. And I will read a segment of an article from CBC Canada that reads as follows. Schools go online over protest concerns. 3 Windsor schools moved to online learning on Friday over concerns that the protests may disrupt traffic. The changes comes after consultation with the Windsor Police Service, which say protesters may be increasing their presence around the schools, the local English Catholic board said in a letter to the school communities. The head of Windsor Essex Children's Aid Society took to Twitter Thursday asking protesters to leave children out of the demonstration. Respectfully, please leave your child at home should you choose to participate in a protest at the border. As tensions mount, the threat of disorder is increasing. You do not want your children exposed to this or to risk their safety. Referring to a photo circulating on social media on Thursday, Windsor Major also showed concern about the potential of children being brought to the protest. The fact that I see a picture yesterday where protesters brought what looks like a bus of kids to hold hands across Huron Church Road, even though it was blocked, holy moly, I question the sanity in a decision like that.
Dilkins said that he hopes not to have a similar scene to what's happening in Ottawa, where large numbers of children at tense protests are making it difficult for police to navigate the situation. Police are smart, police are doing all they can, they have lots of intelligence, lots of resources. And before we keep going, I just want to say, if you are bringing your kid or somebody else's kid to these protests that have a lot of rowdy things going on, that engages in illegal activity, where the risk of violence, is decently big, fuck you. Leave kids out of this, okay? It's a danger zone. You shouldn't be using them as tools in this. You shouldn't be putting them at that risk, okay? I just want to have that said. Furthermore, there's also been further evidence of militant presence. So, for instance, on February 14th, guns, munitions, and body armor was seized from people at the Coup border blockade, which, is mildly concerning. But a day following that, 4 men were charged with conspiracy to murder officers in connection with the border protest there, and all the munitions and all the, weapons and armor that was found there. So you have often evidence of like a more militant wing as well that's forming around these convoys, which obviously, is a fairly big risk towards the personnel working there to try to get this settled down and other civilians in the local areas. Furthermore, there's also a lot of outside funding that has been connected to the, the protests as a whole. A Vice article recently came out where they talk about a list of names for people who have donated to the Freedom Convoy. And they did breakdowns by nationality, and they found the following. Analysis of the leaked data by extremist researcher Amarnath, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Amarnath Amorasingham, apologies for mispronouncing, shows that while the majority of donors came from the US, 56%, and Canada, 29%, there are also thousands of donations from overseas, including the UK, Australia, and Ireland. So most of the donations going into this aren't coming from Canada itself. A lot of it is coming from the US, but there's also a big fraction that is coming from other places internationally that are being sent here. So this leads us to believe that there is quite a bit of international, things going on here. There is some funding being directed into for these freedom convoys that are not coming from, people domestically who are having these issues, or people on the US side of things. That is important to notice here. But yeah. There have been a number of bridges that were blocked by the convoy, and obviously these bridges results in a lot of loss of economic activity and damages and the rest of it. And to my knowledge, as of this moment, all the bridges are reopened and there is passengers going through there. The major thing going on right now, to my knowledge, is the convoy is around basically the Canada's equivalent of the Capitol building in Ottawa. The police in Ottawa are at the moment greatly outnumbered when it comes to the things that are happening there. And hey, I mean, if there is any semblance of Canada's polite reputation that remains after this, it's going to be the politeness of the Canadian police, who have acted in an extraordinarily restrained way towards these protests and have had that as a focal point throughout their entire thing here. Now, with this situation, with these protests that have gone on for like 3 weeks now, it was posited a few days ago that the Canadian government might file a state of emergencies when it comes to dealing with the remaining convoys in Canada. For us to get through this, we're going to read a little bit of the Canadian government statement on the Emergency Act and what it entails and what it means. The federal government declares a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act to end disruptions, blockades, and the occupation of the city of Ottawa. News release. The Government of Canada's top priority remains to keep people and communities safe and to protect jobs, trade, and our economy. The federal government is working with provinces and municipalities to get the current situation under control and end the ongoing illegal blockades and occupations taking place across the country. Today, the Honourable David Lametti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, with the support of the Honourable Marco Medicino, Minister of Public Safety, and the Honourable Bill Blair, President of the Queen's Privy Council in Canada and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, a lot of honourable people there, announced the declaration of public order emergency under the Emergencies Act to end disruptions, border blockades, and the occupation of Ottawa's downtown core. The public order emergency grants the government the authority to apply the following temporary measures. Number 1, regulating and prohibiting public assemblies, including blockades, other than lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent. Number 2, regulating the use of specific property, including goods to be used with respect to a blockade. Number 3, designating and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. For example, borders, approaches to borders, other critical infrastructure. Number 4, directing specified persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. Number 5, authorizing or directing specified financial institutions to render essential services to relieve the impact of blockades, including by regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund or support the blockades. Number 6, measures with respect to authorizing the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to enforce municipal and provincial laws by means of incorporation by reference. Number 7, the imposition of fines or imprisonment for contravening on any of the measures declared under this public order emergency. In order to declare a public order emergency, the Emergencies Act requires that there be an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada that are so serious as to be a national emergency. Threats to the security of Canada may include the threat or use of acts of serious violence against person or property for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective. A national emergency is urgent, temporary, and critical situation that seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians that cannot be effectively dealt with by the provinces or territories, or that seriously threatens the ability for the Government of Canada to preserve sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. It must be a situation that cannot be effectively dealt with by any other law of Canada. When a declaration of public order emergency is made under the Emergencies Act, it allows the federal government to make orders and regulations that it believes are necessary for dealing with the emergency, on reasonable and proportional grounds. The Emergencies Act has stringent, built-in protections which ensure democratic oversight of the use of these powers. Any declaration under the Emergency Act must be laid before both the House of Commons and the Senate within timelines set out for the Act for confirmation. Any steps taken by the government under the Emergencies Act must be consistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and must be reasonable and proportional to the risk of public safety and safety of Canadians. Anyone participating in the blockades is urged to return to their communities peacefully and immediately. The government's top priority remains to keep people and communities safe and to protect jobs, trade, and our economy. These blockades must be brought to an end, and the federal government will continue working on every option to end them. A lot of people are saying weird things about this Emergency Act. A lot of people are acting like this is something that Justin Trudeau, for instance, can unilaterally do and get done, which is not the case. It needs to pass through the House of Commons, which is basically the Canadian Parliament. So there is a step of representative democracy that takes into there. It's not something that can just be declared by Trudeau like that. It needs to pass through that democratic institution, that democratic parliament for that to be done. So just wanted to point that out there because that's something I've seen floating around. Now, to further build and perhaps understand the reasons behind why a state of emergency has been declared, we can talk a bit about the damages that has been done by these convoy protests to Canada as a nation and their economy. So the first thing we can talk about is the heavy damages to the economy. So Ambassador Bridge, the major, but once again, only one of the many bridges that were shut down for periods of times because of the convoys, had a $3 billion economic impact, according to the mayor. So here's a source from this, from CBC. Ambassador Bridge reopens with heavy police presence around former Windsor protest sites, Ontario. 6-day shutdown of international crossing had a $3 billion economic impact, says the mayor. So the shutting down of this bridge had massive, like billions and billions and billions of dollars of economic effects and economic harms that were brought about by it being closed for a period of 6 days. Now, this is just one bridge, but beyond this, there's also the more long-term issue. And there is an article written on this. It's written in the Star, the Toronto Star, by Heather Schofield, an economics columnist, that is titled, "Border Protests May End, but the lasting damage to Canada's economy has already been done." And what is meant by this is that one of the major reasons and one of the major factors that goes into where, companies want to settle down and where they want to invest has to do with the security, the safety, and the stability of those regions. You don't want to invest a fuck ton of money into an area that is unstable and that can lead to very, very, stuff like this happening, basically, where you can have a very, very important bridge just be shut down for 6 days at a time. Thus, because of all the events that have happened and the government response to it, Canada is now a far less attractive option for investors. Canada, which has previously been regarded as a nation who has a very strict, abiding to the law, is a very, very stable nation. Now that kind of perception of Canada is a bit shaken. So it is likely that we see some reductions in investment opportunities for Canada following this because, of this damage that the convoys have done to the perceived security and stability of Canada as a nation. Furthermore, $3 billion in damages, and that's just for one bridge. A lot more damages overall in the economy. A lot of businesses have to shut down. This is fairly obvious. But then there's also more like health-oriented ones where the protesters idling trucks, which basically the trucks that are just on and sitting there because they're part of the convoy, they're part of the blockage, make the air quality, in those areas significantly worse. And we can read through this article a little bit. So measurements of one air pollutant hit a level more than 14 times higher than the average for Ottawa. Fumes from the anti-vaccine mandates protesters' trucks and smoke from their barbecues and campfires is damaging air quality in downtown Ottawa. Local resident Bonnie Charette says she wears a mask downtown, partly as a COVID-19 precaution and partly because of what she calls a stench in the air. The smell is disgusting. Here we have the smell stuff, which sucks, but it's not the major things, but yeah. Paul Villanueva, an environmental epidemiologist for Carleton University, said diesel engine emission contains a number of harmful substances. Those things include arsenic, formaldehyde, benzene, and many others of these have been shown to cause cancer and affect the cardiorespiratory system. Diesel emissions contain known pollutants such as nitrogen dioxide, which can irritate the nose and throat, and find particular matters such as PM 2.5. Noxious pollutant. PM 2.5 is a noxious pollutant, said Dewstone, an atmospheric science expert and professor emeritus of air pollution meteorology at the University of British Columbia. Particles of that size tend to lodge deep inside your lungs, and ultimately, with long-term inhalation, can produce serious health effects. Experts suggest that in the short term, exposure to elevated levels of these particles can aggravate respiratory conditions like, for example, asthma. So once again, you have a lot of pollution. You have a very, very strong reduction in air quality that is made worse by things like the urban canyon effect. So unless there's a very high wind, the pollutants are going to be trapped there, he said. And of course, that's where people live and move and breathe. So it's going to remain there for a while because, a lot of pollutants are going to be heavier than the, average weight of the air composition, and therefore going to trend downwards. And, a lot of cities and stuff, they're kind of built in canyons or valleys of sorts, so it's going to stay there and be trapped there unless there's some strong winds to blow them away. So it's going to have some long-lasting effects there. And yeah, once again, a really strong reduction in air quality that make things a lot worse on a long-term perspective when it comes to cardiopulmonary issues, but also for people that have more immediate health issues relating to the respiratory system, like, for instance, asthma, as an example given here. So there's also harms like that and damages like that taking place. And because of that, a state of emergencies was declared, and it was done democratically through the House of Commons. But wait, I hear you say. Technically, we don't know if the majority of people are okay with this being done or these actions being taken, or what the democratic opinion is on any of this, on the convoy protests, on, the mandates and stuff like that. Maybe it's the government acting anti-democratically and then people having this massive backlash about it. So to address that, we're going to go through a wide range of different public opinion polls on issues relating to this and the convoy and the State of Emergencies Act right now. So when it comes to restrictions as a whole, and this is for Canada then. We can see here on COVID-19monitor.org, monitoring the social impact of COVID-19. The COVID-19 monitor measures the ongoing impact and implications of the novel coronavirus pandemic. It includes unique indicators that offer robust insights into societal health and well-being. The site is updated regularly with results from an ongoing public opinion study about COVID-19 conducted by Vaush Pop Labs, a social enterprise fund founded and operated by academics. So right now it's on Canada as a setting, and here they talk about the proportion of population supportive of restrictions in a wide range of different aspects of society. So we see that there is an above 50% support for some degree of restrictions, which, keep in mind, the part of the protest and the convoys is to get rid of all restrictions for practically every single facet of society apart from parks, restaurants and cafes, and schools. In literally everything else, there is widespread popular support for restrictions for the things that are happening in Canada. But you might be like, okay, well, maybe people might have a bit more of okay with restrictions generally, but they really support the protests and what's going on there. That's not true at all either. So a poll conducted by the Angus Reid Institute in Canada has found that 3 in 4 Canadians tell convoy protesters go home. 3 out of 4 respondents think that they should go home now. They've made their point. You're done. Please leave. 6% are not sure. They don't know. And 22% say that they need to keep going. So once again, almost 75%, 3 in 4 of the people in Canada are just like, hey, leave. You're done. We don't want you here anymore. You got to go. Then there is also further polling on people's attitudes towards the protest as a whole, which we can read through there on an Ipsos poll. So 6 in 10, 59%, agree that the truck protest is mostly a group of anti-vaxxers and bigots intent on causing mayhem and that they should not be allowed to protest. A slim majority agrees that the truck protest is a fundamental attack on our system of democracy. 4 in 10, so a minority, thinks that the truck protest is mostly economically disadvantaged Canadians letting governments know that they are struggling. 4 in 10, once again, similar minority, think that the truck protest is just like those being held by Indigenous groups, Black Lives Matter and environmental groups, and 1 in 3, so a slightly smaller minority, says the truck protest is no big deal, politicians and media are overreacting to it. So overwhelmingly, people are not happy with the protests and the convoys and stuff that's going on there. And then you might say that, like, hold on, wait a minute. That can entirely be true, but does that mean that the public supports things like, for example, the State of Emergencies Act and the state of emergency that Canada has been placed under right now to deal with these things? Well, the findings there also indicate yes. So from Mara Group, which is another polling institutions, February 17th, so as of yesterday, they polled on this, and they said that the results of the national survey released today by Mara Public Opinions finds that 2/3, 66%, a supermajority of Canadians support Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's bringing in the Emergencies Act to give the federal government extra powers to handle the protests across the country. So you have a supermajority as well supporting the Emergencies Act when it comes to whether or not that should be enacted and that should be done towards dealing with these issues. However, now it's time to give the other side of the topic, and there is pretty strong opposition for this as well from some fairly reputable places. Most notably, and one that I want to focus on, is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which is basically like the American Civil Liberties Union. I think that's what it's called, the ACLU, but it's the Canadian equivalent. And this is their statement on it. CCLA will fight Invocation of Emergencies Act in court. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, CCLA, announced today that it will pursue litigation to challenge the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. We have retained Ewa Krajewska of Hainen Hutchinson LLP to take the federal government to court. We have said all along that the federal government did not meet the high burden necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act, said Noah Mendelsohn Aviv, executive director of the CCLA. This morning, I listened carefully to the Prime Minister and heard no new legal justifications for a national emergency and the enormous power the government is hoping to give itself to bypass the typical democratic process. The situation in Ottawa has been complicated, difficult, and painful, in particular for marginalized communities who have experienced racial and homophobic intimidation by some. Governments have already had the lawful authority to address difficult situations and do so all the time. This use of the Emergencies Act is unnecessary, unjustifiable, and unconstitutional. Our society needs peaceful assembly, a critical democratic tool, even though not every person agrees with the content of every movement. Some protests can even be disruptive. It is possible for a gathering to be both disruptive and also peaceful and non-violent. Disruptive protests that may be unlawful, like blocking a pipeline or occupying a public space, can also be the most effective way of raising awareness for people who do not have power, concluded Mendelsohn Aviv. We do not want to minimize the impacts that the protests are occurring across the country. But while some of the blockades have been immensely disruptive, it is unclear that the ongoing protests endanger the lives or health of safety of Canadians, so as to rise to the threshold of national emergency under the law, said Abby Deshman, Director of Criminal Justice for the CCLA. The emergency orders that the government has tabled are not targeted. They are not limited to specific protests or specific geographic locations. They are expansive emergency orders that have already come into effect and apply equally across the entire country. And they place unprecedented restrictions on every single Canadian's constitutional rights. The current emergency orders place significant limits on peaceful assembly across the entire country. They require financial institutions to turn over personal financial information to CSIS and RCMP, and to freeze the bank accounts and cut off financial services provided to anyone who has attended or has been provided assistance to those participating in a prohibited assembly, all without judicial oversight. It is in light of all these violations of civil liberties that we will be taking the government to court, finished Deshman. Now, regardless of whether or not you support the Emergencies Act, we should all be able to agree that this is a good thing. That we need civil liberties unions to challenge governments whenever they do big things, even if they may be wrong. Even if, let's say that we know for a fact, and that it's a fact of the universe that the CCLA is wrong and the government is fully within the right to do this. We need things like this. We need examples of institutions challenging the government and taking them to court and just ratifying and making sure that everything is functioning perfectly. And for that, we need to recognize it for what it is, and we need to say that we appreciate this to some extent. A few things that we can notice here is that it comes into effect across the entire country. Now, Trudeau has said that this will be applied in a geographically limited way, but it seems as if technically there are capabilities of using it across the entirety of Canada. So that's one thing I want to point it out, that you have Trudeau's word, and then you have like what is actually the capacity for everything that's going on overall. And I think that's the major thing to think about here. So there is definitely a side that notices that, hey, there is something wrong with this, and we don't know if this invocation of the Emergency Act is constitutional and whether or not it should be allowed. So you have two sides on this given topic, and I think that there is complexities here when it comes to legal precedent and when it comes to other things going on that need to be determined. And I do think that it's a good thing that the Canadian Association for Civil Liberties is doing this type of thing and is challenging the government to make sure that everything goes accordingly. Now, with all the facts on the table, with all the information that we have about this, you know, open when it comes to the public polling, when it comes to the damages that have been done, when it comes to the different sides in regards to the implementation of the state of emergency, when it comes to the history of the Canada Convoy protests, what are a few ways that I think about this? And now we're going to move into the more opinion side of things. So while I do think it's good that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association does get at this, I think that the risks of some massive slippery slope thing happening here is fairly unlikely. Canada is ranked among the countries that have some of the best world liberty, some of the best democratic institutions, some of the strongest institutions. It's rated here at a shared 4th place with Australia, Denmark, and Finland. And there's been also some history of basically the predecessor to the Emergencies Act, which was called the War Something Act. I don't quite remember it. And when that was invoked, I think it was in 1988, there was very, very strong pushback, and it was very controversial things. And pretty much right away, once that ceased occurring, there was a wide range of different new checks and balances passed to reduce that from happening. So historically, when we see stuff like this being invoked in Canada, you see even more checks and balances come out of it at the other end, more than like rather than a more, you know, commonly spread usage of it. So I think the risk for slippery slope of like Canada descending into an authoritarian regime is pretty unlikely. So I just want to get that given there. I have seen a lot of socialists state that, hey, this can be used against a potential general strike revolution, which is a lot of socialist preferred way of reaching the socialist society, where like, hey, oh, if we go on a general strike, then they can just do this, they can just do the Emergency Act, and then we're all, you know, kind of like on board and forced to do this. Now, I think that there are a few distinctions here that need to be analyzed. First of all, an important thing is the public opinion. You have strong public opinion, both in support of the restrictions, which is the reason why all this happened, as well as against these convoys, as well as for the Emergency Act, which hopefully, if you're engaging in some form of like civil act in order to improve the society, you have the majority of the people on board for that movement. But furthermore, there's a difference between what's happening here and what a general strike would look like. A general strike would look like potentially sit-ins, but also I think in very, very large part, people just not going to work. People seizing work in order to try to get something done and get something to be pushed through. Now, what the state of emergencies does here is it's implemented in a way to stop you from doing something or from being somewhere more specifically. It doesn't seem like the state of emergencies has the ability to force you to do something, to force you to go to work, which would be something that would be needed in order to kind of state of emergencies your way out of a general strike, for instance. So that's another thing I want to point out here. However, my opinion at the moment is that I think that going straight to a full-on state of emergencies where you invoke things like the potentials for asset freezing, I think that is very heavy-handed. I think that there's a lot of steps in between that ought to have been taken and that ought to be taken before you go straight to the very, you know, hard end of things when it comes to what the government should do in order to fight against, these convoys that are you know, limiting economic activity and are engaging in basically occupations in Ottawa at the moment. We have seen some success with the other things. So for instance, some of the major things going on was the blockage of bridges. And we have seen that, hey, all of those issues, to my knowledge right now, have been resolved when it comes to getting people cleared out of there, which sets a pretty good precedent for the ability for more like law enforcement agencies to be able to deal with these things without needing to invoke, you know, kind of like government control of financial assets and stuff like that and freezing that. And I think that there is a lot that the law enforcement can do before we get to the point where we should do that. I think one of the major things that should be done first is for the State of Emergencies Act to be declared to the extent where extra law enforcement resources and personnel are sent down to Ottawa, because what's happening right now is Ottawa's police department is overrun. And first of all, seeing if that solves the issues before you go to the asset freezing. Furthermore, I do think that this may already be the thing, but from my reading on the state of emergencies, I haven't found this, that there ought to be differing kind of steps to a state of emergencies or different degrees to which it can be invoked. So I think that right now the state of emergencies is super, super big, right? There's a wide range of different things here that are very, very different insofar as what they're able to do. So it's, you know, basic things like designating and securing places where blockages are to be prohibited, borders, approaching to borders, other critical infrastructure. Between like things like that, which are, I mean, they aren't anything light, but they aren't a super big deal as opposed to like the freezing of personal financial assets and accounts, which is a very, very drastic escalation of that. So I think that maybe a better system to have is for an Emergencies Act to have different degrees so that you can invoke like a first degree of it, and then you kind of have like a limited degree of things you can actually do, instead of like, hey, so we actually only want to do the basic things of the Emergency Act, but in order to be allowed to do that, you guys need to give us the power to do all this other shit as well, which seems like, you know, it can hold people back, and it can make people very uncomfortable and can make people be very iffy on what the government's going to do in this given situation. So I think that the state of emergencies can be divided a bit more so that it's not just like all or nothing, and so you can kind of take it in increments. And I do believe that the major thing that probably should have been done now is try to take a few steps in between what's been done so far and freezing financial assets when it comes to the ability for law enforcement and personnel to kind of step in there before you go to fairly, you know, like extreme and yeah, and kind of risky and very heavy-handed restrictions, like the ability for banks to you know, through a kind of like court order, be able to like freeze accounts and assets and the rest of it. Another thing I want to mention is that there's another aspect to this, which is very important that we mention and that we recognize, which is that, I think it's here. There are a few more key findings to this one here where they say that most people are fine with the Emergencies Act. And I think we should go through them a little bit. A vast majority, 82%, say that there is no way this protesting should have gone on for as long as it has. 67% believe it's time to clear out the protesters in Ottawa, even if it means people who will not leave get hurt or worse. 50% says that they're proud of the way police have handled the situation. 71% thinks Canada is an international embarrassment for not being able to run its own country. 54% say they're ashamed to be Canadian because of how their politicians have let this protest get out of hand. 68% say that regardless of political strife, the politicians who contribute to or support these protests should be voted out of office. 56% believe that while the premiers say that there was time to lower COVID-related restrictions, all they've done is cave to the protesters and given them what they wanted. And 32% say that they're partial to taking up violent actions to protect their fundamental Canadian values. So another very important thing to note here is that a lot of people are really disappointed at Canada's performance of it. Because what are you going to hear? If you have somebody like me and I'm like, hey, this feels very, very heavy-handed, there feels like there's a lot of steps you could have done in between, then you're going to have Canadians that are very, very rightfully upset at how long this has gone on for 3 weeks and the way that's disrupted both their personal, their micro lives, and also the macro structures that they interact with, being like, I don't fucking care. Get these people out. It has gone on for far too long. Throw everything we have at them. This needs to fucking stop. And if that means dipshit militia... No, I'm kidding. Yeah, but the protests need to fucking stop, okay? I understand that perception. But we also need to recognize is that there's a reason why it took so long. I think that the Canadian government's handling of the situation has been very poor. I think that the police department's handling of it has also been not optimal. However, I recognize the police departments, the local police departments especially, have a lot more of a limitation in resources than what the government has. I think that the government should have, instead of kind of being hyper polite and kind of, you know, taking strong actions after very long days, like 6 days of one of the biggest bridges, $3 billion in damages, and it took them 6 days to go in there and do something about it. I think they've been overly permissive of the amount of damage that has been done of it for a long period of time. And now that people are super frustrated, they can kind of invoke like, oh, okay, sorry, we'll do everything we can to do it. When really what they should have been doing is kind of slowly escalating it throughout the entire thing, instead of kind of being like, you know, it's calm, you know, we're going to be polite Canadians. We're going to seize all your fucking assets, right? And that's important to recognize. I understand why people are okay with the seizing of assets. I understand because it's been going on for a really long time. It's really disrupted people's lives. I understand that. I do think that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association should do their lawsuit and do the thing and check if there's anything that was violated here. But more than anything, I think that the reason why we're in the situation where we're at right now, where we're even having the discussions about the invocation of the Emergency Act, insofar as they can kind of like seize assets and stuff like that, or freeze assets, I should say. I think in large parts that's the Canadian government's fault for not having a kind of like an incremental increase to the type of pushback and the type of response that Canada's government and police departments have had towards these protests, and have kind of played softball with them for so long, to the point where it's gotten to the point where they have like a plausible deniability in invoking the states of emergencies, which I think is problematic. Overall, that's what I have to say about it. Once again, none of the things in the second part of my opinions are super duper set in stone. There can be facts revealed that make me change my mind on this. The main focus is, I hope that people look at my analysis here, find some things that they agree with, find some things that they think is important. Yeah, and then maybe go from there. Maybe that makes them think of something in a different way. Most importantly, it's complicated, believe it or not. And I've just tried to provide some more analysis information so that the discourse about this and people have better ideas of what's actually going on. And yeah, thank you very much.